everyone, and welcome back to the Heal with Kat podcast. My name is Kat, and I am your host, and I am so honored to welcome you to this week's episode. I just got out of my interview with Willie Handler, my guest this week, and I have been covered in full body chills because of just Willie and who he is as a person. It was kind of this instant connection. I feel like we got on the episode and I was like, okay, I feel like I'm hanging out with like one of the buddies, like like a friend almost. Willie is such a down to earth and grounded human being who you can tell has a huge heart and is all about giving back to the Jewish community and talking about the Holocaust and being a Holocaust survivor and intergenerational trauma. And I'll tell you a little bit about his official bio, but some of the topics that we talk about in today's episode may be a bit triggering for people who are survivors of the Holocaust or are second, third, fourth generation of Holocaust survivors. But there is a very profound communal and heart-based conversation that we aim to have in the episode today that really is based on Willie's sense of his mission and his purpose around bringing Jews together who he says have not talked about the traumas that their families have been through for a very, very long time. And even he himself has gone through this very kind of therapeutic process of writing the memoir Out from the Shadows with 97 stories of Holocaust survivors, including his own family. And he says that the key to moving through this and the trauma is to be vocal and talk about it. And that was the mission of him writing this book. So let me tell you a little bit about Willie. Willie Handler has reinvented himself on several occasions throughout his work career. He has been a hospital administrator, a government policy manager, an insurance expert, and consultant. But following his retirement from the Ontario Public Service, Willie began a writing career. He has published 3 fiction novels and numerous journal articles over the past few years. He is a member of the Canadian Authors Association, Writing Community of York Region, Toronto chapter of Sisters in Crime, and the Stephen Leacock Association. Willie is active in Toronto's Holocaust second generation and third generation survivor community, participating in educational programs, commemorative events, and group discussions. He is also a volunteer at the Toronto Holocaust Museum, where he assists students and visitors as they make their way through the museum's gallery. Willie has spoken online and at in-person events on the Holocaust and his family's experience. He has now written a memoir called Out from the Shadows, which just released a few weeks ago, which covers his family's history and his experience growing up with parents who were Holocaust survivors. He is currently working on an oral history book about intergenerational trauma in children of Holocaust survivors, and I will absolutely be having him back on the podcast to talk about that book. I have a lot of people on the podcast who are authors who come on to talk about their books, and there have been a handful of times that I actually do read the books that they write. This is one that I am super interested in. I think as somebody who is a second generation of war survivors, my family immigrated from Lebanon and my family was directly affected by the war. I've always grown up with this curiosity about how war impacts people. And I remember when I was getting into family constellation therapy that many people said, you're going to heal your family's trauma, especially when it comes to the war. And I worked on my dad's family for 10 years. And I talk about this in the episode. I even get super emotional about it. But there's nothing quite like the energetic, vibrational, and emotional, and even epigenetic impact that war has on a human being, on a society, on a group of people. And of course, this is through the lens of a Jewish man who is proud of where he comes from and is healing and breaking cycles. I think it's important to keep a very open mind and an open heart in today's conversation because you are hearing straight from a Jewish man's mouth what it's like to be a second generation of a Holocaust survivor. So keep that in mind this week, guys. And, I just love the podcast and being able to provide people's stories. Willie talks about this in the episode. People's stories are what make an impact. And how do you stop repeating history? You tell the stories and you say, like, this is what we need to learn and this is what we need to talk about, and people being vocal about it. So if you have somebody in your life who is part of the Jewish community, who is Jewish, who is second, third, even fourth generation, if it's appropriate, of Holocaust survivors, share it with them, send it their way. So guys, with that, Thanks for being here and welcome, Willie, to the Heal with Kat podcast. Willie, I am so honored to have you on the podcast today on the Heal with Kat podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm glad that I'm welcome.
You definitely are. And we were just chatting before we pressed record, and the topic that we're talking about today is so sensitive to people's family systems. And I think so many people hesitate bringing the topic up because it was such a profound impact on families, individuals, and even our world. I would love for you to start telling the audience about you, a bit of your life story, and kind of what's brought you into what you're doing today.
Well, um, I am a child of two Holocaust survivors, the middle child, in fact. I don't know if that makes a difference, but some people think so. And my parents were both traumatized um, because of their experience in the war, but they came to Canada, reestablished their lives, raised families, worked hard. Um, but you can't, you can't, it's very difficult to bury that trauma and not have it come out. And as parents, they were different. When I was young, I thought we were a typical immigrant family, but we weren't. And uh, and so as a result, some of that trauma that they experienced was passed on to me. As I grew up, I managed to become independent, but built up a lot of walls around me. And it worked really, really well for much of my life. I had a very successful career. I'm 71 now, so I'm not a youngster. And it was only recently that I accidentally unburied all that trauma. And that was through writing a book. And the book was about myself and my family. And as the memories flooded back, it unleashed this torrent of trauma that I am still dealing with.
What are the uncoverings that you discovered? You said accidentally. I'm guessing maybe you just started writing the book, and then did you have people to ask questions to? Were you looking in certain, what avenues were you finding all this out?
Well, it was actually a book that I never wanted to write.
Oh,
And
be
to be
honest.
honest, I um, I actually had authored already three fiction books before I wrote a memoir. So, I've had some writing experience. It was during the pandemic. Everybody, some people had a pandemic project. Mine was, and I wasn't alone. And my wife was really urging me, pushing me to write my family story. My parents are both gone now. And I was very reluctant. I didn't actually have that much information. And, as, and in fact, the first time I wrote my parents' story out, it was a 1,800 word blog. That's all I knew. And I thought to myself, I can't turn this into a book. There's no way. I don't know enough. And so I started to do a lot of digging. And I had a lot of different sources. I couldn't go to my parents and ask them, and they actually did not share very much, in particular, my father, who was quite traumatized. And so I started searching through uh, online databases, archives for documents. I went through history books, uh, uh, studies and papers. I found my mother's survivor testimony that she did for Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. I had never listened to it.
Oh my goodness.
It was she did in 1995. I didn't listen to it until 3 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And other survivors' testimonies, and started to pull together the story, and trying. And I spoke to my siblings, trying to remember some of our some of what we experienced as children and growing up, and as I mentioned, the harder I sort of dug into my memory and my past, more trauma began to come out. So at one point, I kind of crashed, and I I had to do what I needed to do because I had to get this book out, and I sought therapy.
That's a really big step to take the time to really invest in yourself and go to therapy and talk about the effects of the generational trauma from the Holocaust that your parents went through.
Is very powerful. And I really dig deep into the generational trauma. In fact, the last rewrite I did was after I started therapy, because guess what? The therapy process, you know, brought more stuff out,
Mm-hmm.
and that I actually used in the book.
Mm-hmm. I think many children of Holocaust survivors, you know, now we're kind of getting into multiple generations here, but they struggle to make sense of their parents' trauma or their grandparents' trauma because so many people I think are not telling the stories. So how has storytelling, both a little bit of your own and others, played a role in the larger healing for you and even the communities you're a part of?
Well, I've
Besides it being a little not cathartic, but maybe therapeutic in a sense.
yes. Well, the interesting thing is, uh, when I finished this book, I didn't feel I was finished with the topic,
Mm.
and so one day I kind of it came to me because, and I actually had started writing another book. I had started writing another fiction book, and I like kind of just pushed it aside and said, no, that's not what I'm doing next. And I had this great idea that I was going to write a book about generational trauma,
Mm.
but not my trauma, but others in that same community. And maybe I was a little bit inspired because back in the late 70s, this one child survivor, her name's Helen Epstein, wrote a groundbreaking book about children of survivors. And she went, she went, traveled around the world and interviewed several hundred children survivors. But those people that she interviewed were all under 30. They were sort of young adults because it was 1970. It was like in the 70s. So they were young adults. And it was a fascinating book because it did reveal a lot about that whole generation. But nothing really changed because people like myself and others, they never talk about their experiences. They really do hold it in. So I thought it would be interesting if I was to sort of do something similar, but I would be talking to these people who are now in their 60s and 70s, um, and reflect more on not just being a child, but being an adult, and dealing with their aging survivor parents or grandparents, raising their own families. And I also interviewed some grandchildren, sort of a third generation, who in themselves were even older than the people that Helen Epstein interviewed, because they were in their like 30s and 40s. And it was very, very interesting because a part of, I guess part of it is that when you get to a certain stage in your life, life slows down, maybe you retire, you become very reflective. And man, did I get some amazing stuff from those people. But it was quite triggering. And I've finished the interviews interviewed 97 people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I remember when I told my therapist I was doing this project, her reaction was, "What? Why?"
What did you say?
Um, I think she thought that I was doing it as part of my therapy. And I immediately say, well, it's not for me because it's not going to be an easy thing to do. I just feel there's a need that the community needs to read this stuff and find out that they're not alone, that they should be speaking out, they should be telling people about how they feel. And wow, did I hear some, like, this book is uh, going to be quite incredible. An agent already signed me.
Oh, congratulations.
The book's not even written yet
Oh my
because
gosh.
she heard about it, and I have clinicians and academics reaching out, wanting to know what I'm doing.
Wow.
So I think it's going to be even bigger
Mm,
than my memoir.
mm. It's so powerful when you talk about this. I have goosebumps because I think you're giving other people permission to say like, "Hey, I also have feelings about this experience and you're not alone in your feelings with this experience." You keep talking about the experience of writing the book being triggering, and I'm sure you had moments where the weight of everything felt truly overwhelming. How did you find the motivation or the inspiration to keep moving forward? I'm sure you were hearing some pretty heavy stuff.
Um, yeah, and to be honest, and it's something I learned as I went along, is that not only did I have generational trauma, I also experienced childhood trauma, which is quite different. And I didn't even realize I had childhood trauma. And so what I learned was, my parents, they were they were loving parents, in fact, almost smothering, but they were also distant and uninvolved.
Hmm.
They were focused on providing family with very basic needs: clothes, food, shelter, making sure that we got an education, but really not much more. And I didn't have anyone to help me with homework, take me to sports, help me with problems at school or with friends. None of that. I was on my own. And what it does is, as a young child, it puts you in survival mode. And I think I've been there ever since.
Hmm. It's interesting because I've worked with a few clients who have generational Holocaust trauma in their families. And it is that survival mode, that survival energy that gets passed down. And we take it in as children as these are our beliefs. But I'm curious if you feel comfortable sharing any of the other big kind of generational patterns or findings that you discovered through your family lineage.
Um, yeah. And I would say, in my case, I really have a lack of trust with people. I have difficulty making close relationships, and I have issues with attachment and abandonment. And somehow I made it through life just fine with all these issues, but it really did come to an head when I wrote this book. It's interesting. I get asked a lot, "Gee, wasn't that process cathartic?" and, and it was absolutely not. Um, though I'm still trying to get to that spot, that point in my life. But it was actually very triggering, and which is really why I had to go and seek treatment. Because if I look back about a year and a half ago, I was starting to have panic attacks, anxiety attacks, because I'd written this book. And to be honest, it's a very, very good book, and it's been doing very, very well. But I was terrified of getting it released, and I couldn't see myself talking in front of groups about the book. And as someone who never really shared anything about their life, that was really terrifying, and that's what sent me to therapy. I remember the first time I saw the therapist. She asked me, "Why are you here?" And I'm going, "Well, I wrote this memoir, and I'm terrified because in the next year it's going to come out." And I said, "I can't. I don't know how I'm going to be able to handle it." And actually, the book was released um, just 4.5 weeks ago, and I did just fine.
Oh, congratulations. So give us the official title of the book.
The book is called "Out from the Shadows: Growing Up with Holocaust Survivor Parents."
Hmm. And in the book, do you dive deep into the generational aspect of the book, or is it more storytelling?
Oh, it goes pretty deep. It's pretty heavy. I have to tell you, this is a very interesting process as the book was being written. Is I remember, as I said, I'm not really good at sharing and talking about myself. In fact, I have friends, very close friends, who read the book and goes, "You never talked about any of this stuff
Oh,
before."
wow.
That this is exactly what put me in therapy. So I remember an early draft. I had shared it with somebody in the publishing industry, and he came back and says, "It's a great biography, but you told me it was supposed to be a memoir."
Oh.
so, so what happened is, I did all this great research and everything. I wrote a great book, but didn't put myself in it. Really, not. It was like almost I'm an observer as opposed to about me. And so I went through this process. I went back and started. I did several rewrites, and I remember passing it on to a close friend, said a writing friend, and said, "What do you think?" And she goes, "No, still not there." So I did about four rewrites, and the finished product, I'm pretty driven. And I remember people telling me, "You're doing too many interviews. You need to give yourself some space." I think 1 week I did 8 interviews.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, that was not a good idea. I was a mess. I was like a mess. So I kind of slowed down a little bit and kind of cut it back to like 4 or 5 a week, and tried to not to do more than one a day. It was really, really challenging, but it was also so rewarding, and so it's interesting. And the fee and just the feedback I got from the people I interviewed, they were so appreciative of what I was doing. They treated me like I was like something special, which I'm not. I remember the very first interview I did. I thanked the person for volunteering to tell their story and trusting me. And she kind of just looked at me and said, "You're one of us.
Oh.
Why wouldn't I tell you?"
Oh, I just got like goosebumps, teary eyed. That's
And
beautiful.
and so all these, and so so right off the bat I going, "Oh, this is going to work." And
Mm.
everyone just opened up. There were people who told me, "You're the first person I ever told my story to." Yeah, it was incredible.
What a gift. What a gift you're giving others through this, truly. I'm really excited to read it. And your secondary book that's coming out too after the memoir about the generational trauma, because
Yeah.
in my work with family constellation therapy, it's ancestral trauma healing, and I find that there's a really common theme with people who have had ancestors in the Holocaust, which is a need to keep themselves small and a fear of being seen.
Oh,
There is
yes.
there is a fear
That's
that if
me.
they are
That's
seen,
me.
right? And so I'm curious, did you see that with a lot of other people? Like, why haven't they been telling their stories? Why are you the first person they're talking to about it?
I guess the title of my memoir kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah.
which is Out from the Shadows, which was a very challenging thing for me to do. Um, that shadow, which is the cast by the Holocaust, follows you around, and what and I part of the trauma and some of the traits that I inherited was you don't want to be in the spotlight.
Mm.
Uh, I remember one. I remember one person I interviewed. Her father. If you ever saw the film Schindler's List,
Yes. Yeah.
there's a scene where Amos Goth, the commander of Platzov concentration camp, was in his bathroom. He had, just in his suspenders, and he was had his gun out and he was firing. There was a little kid who was playing a bugle, and he was firing at the kid and
Oh.
missed him. That kid is a real person and was the father of one of the people that I interviewed.
Oh my goodness.
And one of the things her father always said was never stand in the line of fire. I wonder
Wow.
where that came from.
Mm.
And she is a Holocaust educator. She goes around
Mm.
the U.S. and speaks to groups, especially school groups, about the Holocaust. And as a concession to her, and her dad was furious that she was doing this.
Mm.
And the one concession that her she made to her dad is she wore a bulletproof vest.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Um, and sort of your typical fatalistic child of survivor. Well, if I get shot, they're only going to get me in an arm or leg, so I'll survive and still be able to speak.
Mm.
I mean, that really does reflect this whole generation is that you kind of don't want to stand out. I think my father, he survived probably because you don't want to stand out, because if you're in a my father was in 7 camps, and if you stand out in a camp, it's probably not for a good reason.
Yeah.
And so he kind of lived his life. Don't make a fuss. Don't stand out, and keep your head down. And that kind of thinking gets passed on. So I had a successful career, but I loathed being in the spotlight.
Mm.
And this kind of book, the memoir I wrote, has actually put me in the spotlight. And so even that this whole process has been quite a journey, to say the least. It was the whole writing this book was very transformational.
Do you believe that you're breaking a cycle of some kind by allowing yourself to be in the spotlight when it's been unsafe for everybody else, and in the fact that you're doing it in a healing and service-based way?
Um, that's one of my goals is to break the cycle and help others break the cycle,
Mm.
because you see it, you're starting to see it in the next generation. And I've and not just the next generation, but the fourth generation as well.
Mm.
People have identified signs in their own grandchildren. Even I have. And so, yeah, breaking the cycle is really an important thing, because uh, the theory is that trauma is stored in your body
Mm.
and can be stored genetically as well, and then it's easily passed on. And so, obviously, it's in my genes. And really, what's the best way of countering this? Is talking about it, not not holding it in.
Mm.
And I think that's this, and really that goes without saying for any kind of trauma. It doesn't have to be generational trauma. So you think of all the people who've been traumatized in their life and have never spoken out about it, And that's not a healthy thing.
How do you see that ripple effect of trauma manifesting in the second and third and even fourth generation of Holocaust survivors?
Well, um, about 20% of the people I interviewed were third generation.
Mm.
Um, their own parents, didn't tell them much in the way of their grandparents' story. The grandparents would typically um, were usually quite old or had passed away when they were relatively young, so they never had they didn't necessarily have an opportunity to speak to them. And when you don't know, and this is whether it's second or third generation, what I found is it instills a lifelong need to find out. So many of those third generation people I spoke to have gone to college to specialize in Holocaust studies, which is interesting,
Wow.
and have done extensive research in their families just to find out what happened.
Mm. I think there's a very we live in a very open world now where therapy is very welcome and people can talk about their feelings and it's a little bit more accepted than it was before. And so I'm sure many people, third, fourth generations, are all searching for the connection to the parts of them that they're learning to say, hey, actually, I think this comes from something and I really need to talk about it.
Yeah. And then what complicated matters further was October 7th,
Right.
and not just on October 7th. October 7th was a event that triggered almost every Jew, but especially those who their parents were survivors. But what followed was this flood of anti-Semitism that has not yet cooled off and may
Mm.
never. And uh, most of those that were raised in North America have never experienced anti-Semitism in their life.
Mm.
It was a very um, we live in a very pluralistic society, and where people of where it was not appropriate to outwardly show prejudices, and for some reason that has been thrown that has been thrown out the window, and that very quickly anti-Semitism has been normalized, and so these people are really struggling because they've never experienced this growing up. And here they are, they're kind of in their 60s and 70s and are facing it for the first time, and they don't know how to react.
Mm.
So that's kind of part of what I want to do as well. I have to tell you, I actually 2 months ago started a Facebook group for um, children and grandchildren of survivors, um, just to talk about generational trauma.
Wow.
And that group has exploded.
Wow. We would love to link that in the show notes in case anybody listening wants to join.
It's called Intergenerational Trauma and Descendants of Holocaust Survivors. And so you will find that group. Uh, the only uh, the only criteria to join is that you are a second or third generation survivor.
Hmm. What is your biggest hope for this work that you're doing, not just with writing the book, but creating communities and giving people safe places to talk about their family's trauma?
Um, it's a good question. Why am I doing this? Uh, I just, you know what? I feel I have an obligation.
Hmm.
Um, that this is a complex community that I belong to, um, and I have the skill sets to do this. I, I'm because I'm a very good writer, and that's a very important communication skills. But I have other skills as well, organizational skills and so on and so forth. So I can pull stuff together, and um, I just know people will benefit from it. And I sort of at a point in my life where what do I have better to do
Mm.
than than help people um, get through difficult times, and in some cases, the aging process also kind of brings out some of this trauma, so that it helps them deal with that as well, um, uh, and maybe improve relationships with family members.
Mm.
I should point out that one of the things I observed is um, that a lot of the people I interviewed, um, they had not very good relationships, for instance, with siblings,
Mm.
and in many cases, they were no, weren't they weren't speaking to them. I found that quite unusual because they've lost so much family, and here they are with so little family, and they've ostracized each other. Recently, I spoke to a gerontologist who specializes in who specialized her whole. She's quite old now, but her whole career on working with Holocaust survivors and their families. And I asked her about it. She says, "Well, they didn't have role models. They don't have role models. No grandparents, often no aunts and uncles. So there's no blueprint for how to get along with family members." It's
Mm.
kind of sad.
Mm.
And so they're kind of like finding their way, but you don't treat family members and friends the same. And it's kind of another sad part of this whole legacy.
I would imagine it to that point when you said it before you told us what that woman had said. I had wondered in my mind if it was because there was so much trauma around separation that then everyone was getting used to so much separation that that's what, the family system was supposed to look like, was just separation there. But you kind of tied it all together really well with that explanation.
Yeah, there's absolutely, they don't have the relationships in their family to look to how it's done.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's so much guilt in these families, a lot of survivor guilt,
Yeah.
a lot of grief, and there are parents who never got over the loss of parents and siblings. And I should tell you that the name of the next book, which is very appropriate, is The Hidden Victims. Because
Mm.
everybody knows that Holocaust survivors were damaged and traumatized. But most people have no realization um, that the next generation is pretty much just as bad because they never speak about it. No one ever speaks about it.
Mm.
I know, and when I mentioned earlier, some close friends have said, "Oh, I had no clue," because and that's very typical. That a lot of response and a lot of the reviews I've had on the book have basically said, "Wow, I didn't know any of this."
Mm.
And so I think it's kind of an appropriate title because these people are indirectly victims of the Holocaust themselves.
A lot of times in the work that I do, I encourage people to connect with their lineages through the cultures that they come from and the religions that are tied to the cultures as well. I can see in my mind's eye, people kind of picking up this book and reading it and feeling a resonance, even though they may not know that certain things may have happened to their people in their family, but having a resonance with the pain and the grief of this. And if that were to spark somebody, let's just say someone my age in their early 30s, to start looking for the information on their families that survived the Holocaust, or even the ones that may not have. How would you guide someone to do that? What would be your advice on that? Where would they start?
I guess exactly what I did. And in fact, there's a chapter in the book where I really talk about how I went about finding stuff.
Mm.
Um, a- and you start searching for documents, um, names of family members. I didn't even know all the names of family members. My father never spoke of anybody who passed away. So, for instance, he had two sisters who were killed. I knew that he had two sisters. I didn't know their names, but I did. When I started doing searches, I found um, birth records and things like that, marriage records. No death records, of course.
Mm.
Um, and then I found information about the towns that my mother and my father came from, and their experiences were quite different. The final step was 2 years ago. I went to Poland and
Wow.
went to where my father was born and where he's lived, and I found my grandparents' apartment and got copies of birth registrations and marriage registrations. I got to see where a lot of my family members perished.
Did that trip then inspire you now volunteering for the Toronto Holocaust Museum, or when did that start for you?
I think was it was something in the back of my mind when I finished the book that I needed to get more involved in Holocaust education, and then in June, in June of 2023, uh, the new museum opened up. There was an older one. It was quite smaller and different, and through and they'd been promoting it for quite a while because they were raising money for it. And at one point in the spring, they were looking for volunteers, and so I'm sure I was one of the first people to volunteer. And it's sort of a very important place. That museum is more of an educational um, center than an actual museum, and thousands of students go through that every month, and many of them they come there. And I should add, in Ontario now, Holocaust education is mandatory beginning in grade 6,
Hmm.
and so many of them come with very very little knowledge of the Holocaust. I would say 80% of them are not Jewish. I would say 80% of the people who read my book are not Jewish.
Wow.
And so it turns out to be reading my book is educational. I've had many people reach out and say, uh, I had no idea, and I learned so much, and so, things like that. So um, that's so the purpose of my memoir was to make sure that my it was written for my family and my grandchildren. They're given copies, though my grandsons will tell you they're not allowed to read it yet. No, um, but it was written for them so they would know their family story. So my family stories would stay alive. But it was also I felt it was important to keep the entire memory of the Holocaust alive, and so the approach that I took, because somebody once told me to the best way to write about history is to tell people stories.
Hmm.
And the best way to learn about people is to know the history. And so I interlaced my family story with a sort of historical background, and it worked very well.
When you say that, it does make me just a bit emotional because my grandfather wrote a book for our family. My father and his family had to flee Lebanon in the 70s, and they
Mm,
had to flee to France and then come to the US. And my grandfather wrote a book called Soul of a Lion. I'm going to get emotional talking about it. Though that's the
oh,
last piece of my grandfather that I have. And
right.
so the reason I'm so profoundly touched by what you're doing, and I don't have family from the Holocaust, but I know what it means to hold something in your hands and say, I know where I come from. And when I went on my ancestral healing journey, I spent 10 years working on my family's trauma, from Lebanon,
Right.
from immigrating, from you name it. And if I didn't have that book, I would not know so many things. Like, I would not be able to answer so many questions I had. And I remember feeling scared to ask my family, my dad or my other family members, what happened with this? What happened with that? And I'm lucky in the sense that they were willing, but for people whose families are not willing, I love that there's so much available. You wrote this book with 97 stories of people who can share what they went through. And just with a little research and work, you can really find out who your family is and connect back to that.
We have no family heirlooms
Yeah.
because everything was taken away.
Mm.
There's a handful of family photos. I have no photos of my paternal grandfather. I searched high and low, contacted family members. Nobody has a photo. The only so the only thing I can pass down my family is this book.
Yeah.
And you have no idea. I had a sort of a book launch and signing a month ago. How many family members showed up
Wow.
and was just so appreciative that I did all this research, and so that's why I did it. And anyone else who can benefit from reading it, that's just sort of the cherry on top. But it is the family legacy now.
In family constellation therapy, we talk a lot about honoring the people that came before us and how we've forgotten how to honor the lives of the people who came before us. And it feels like you're really doing that with this book too.
Through this process, I really one of the big things that happens, I reevaluated my opinion of my parents.
Wow.
I I have to admit I didn't like my dad very much. He was a pain. He was frustrating to deal with. My mother had her own sort of. She was very sweet, but she had a lot of issues as well. And I growing up, I started resenting them. I was embarrassed by them, frustrated with them, and now I look back and going, my God, what they went through and how they were able to just put it behind them and kind of pull their lives back together. I'm going, that's heroic.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was that was another part of my journey. If I hadn't written that book, I don't think that would have ever happened.
That's breaking
I
the
I could have,
generational cycle there. I love that.
and I have to tell you also that through much of my life, if you would have asked me, "Do you have generational trauma?" Going, not really, because I really did an amazing job in kind of just walling it all in. And as it turns out, I got lots and lots. And so, this journey continues, and so does the therapy and the next book. So I'm kind of very excited about where I'm going as well. So I feel this was like um, a major accomplishment. I remember my wife many times saying, "Aren't you proud of the work you've done?" And going, "No, I just feel like crap."
Yeah.
And it's true. And I was just such in a bad state. And now I'm really, really proud. I've book has been a bestseller, and yeah, it's done amazingly well
Mhm.
for a memoir, and I feel good about it.
That's an
Finally,
amazing feeling. Yeah. Well,
and
and it sounds like you had to go through such a process with it. And now you're reaping the rewards of your vulnerability, of other people's vulnerabilities, and just putting those stories on a platform.
even the process of getting it published was was hard, and and at times really got me down. July of last year, I signed with a agency, a literary agency, to get the book published. I signed in the summer, and the agent told me, look, it's summertime, and the worst time to be sending out pitches to editors at publishers is when they're out of the office because you don't want them to miss it. So he said, not going to do this until after Labor Day. Now, he was Jewish as well. And so, the fall is when there's Jewish holidays. So he said, let's kind of, we'll do it after the Jewish holidays as well. And I'm going, fine. The contract they have an obligation to actually start sending it out within 30 days of signing the contract. But it made sense to delay. And then October 7th happened.
Mm.
He went through sort of a period of, where he's sort of introspective and decided this is not what he wanted to do in his life, and he quit
No
the
way.
industry. Yeah, he passed me on to the VP of the company, and they said they'll find another agent for you, and you'll be okay. So I said, all right, and I followed up with the VP, and she says, oh, don't worry, I'll look after you. She said, I remember she said, send me your manuscript so I can I'll read it over, and then we'll talk about what next steps are. So I sent her the manuscript, and a month later, I get an email. What it said is, "Oh, this is not the right book for me, and I can't represent you."
Oh my
Well, I
goodness.
had a contract with the agency, and it was because of the content.
Oh,
And
what a missed opportunity for them
well,
to.
yeah. So the reality is that, well, I'm glad now it's doing really well. I should write to her and let her know how well I'm doing. Um, but as far as I was concerned, I was canceled because I was Jewish, and I was devastated. I
Mm,
almost tossed that manuscript in the garbage.
mm.
But I started learning that it was happening to a lot of Jewish writers, artists, musicians. It's a real issue that's been going on for the last year, and not getting better. Um, and has nothing to do with Israel or the war. It's just blatant anti-Semitism. And I found a niche publisher earlier this year who specializes in Holocaust books,
Oh wow.
and Amsterdam Publishing. I should give them a plug. And they took on that book in 2 weeks,
Oh my goodness.
and so it turned out well in the end. Uh, but that was a very I went through a very tough fall and winter, um, because I was sure that this thing I was positive I was never going to be able to get this thing published.
And do you believe that sometimes part of that anti Semitism is the fear of talking about really heavy topics like the Holocaust because there's a perception that it's not wanted to be talked about? Or, I mean, what
No,
really is that? What it's
no.
just
I,
blatant
I
anti
think
Semitism.
I think we're in a post-Holocaust. I think October 8th started a post-Holocaust era
Mm,
where if Jewish people were getting any empathy at all because of their history, that ended. And and with it came a lot of buried hate, which I always knew was there.
Mm-hmm.
I always knew because that's our history. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the Holocaust, it goes back several thousand years. um, Hate for Jews is not racism. It is based on conspiracy theories that have
Hmm.
always existed. That Jews killed Christ.
Yeah.
That Jews kill Christian babies
Hmm.
to make their matzah, their unleavened bread.
Huh.
The Jews control a Jewish cabal controls the world. These things have always existed,
Hmm.
and there are even conspiracies today, new ones. For instance, the October 7th attack was actually staged by the Israeli Defense Forces, and that there are no hostages, despite the fact that Hamas regularly, publicizes what they did, and are very proud of what they did.
Right.
But there are people who think that it's all made up. So conspiracy theories are always around,
Hmm.
and there's always ones that are directed at Jewish people, unfortunately. And so it's a very different kind of hate.
I remember in high school, we watched Schindler's List in my world history class. And my teacher was Jewish, and he said that there's people in the world who are alive and well in our day that still don't believe the Holocaust actually happened. And I could not wrap my head around that. I could
It's
not wrap
even,
my head around that.
it's even more now. It grows.
Oh my goodness.
And well, you have the internet, and, and the internet is rife with misinformation, and
Mhm.
that's part of the misinformation that you will get if you look for it. I saw a recent survey, probably from 2022. I can't remember the numbers now, but maybe a third of Americans um, don't believe that the Holocaust ever happened, or not, or either they don't believe it ever happened, or aren't aware of it, have never heard of it.
I can't even wrap my head around that.
I can tell you that it's not just here, but when I was in Poland, my wife and I were out to eat, and we were talking to the server who knew we were tourists. We were in Krakow, which is an hour from Auschwitz, and we were telling her how just the day before we were in Auschwitz, and she asked, "What's that?" She lives in Poland,
Do you think it's a
so
suppression of a shame of like it's a, no one talks about it. It's like no one wants to talk about it because of the shame?
no, because the Poles, the sort of the attitude of Poles was Auschwitz is not a Polish concentration camp.
Oh.
It's a German concentration camp in Poland.
Mhm.
So they um, kind of sort of step back and say, all that bad stuff that happened wasn't us. It was the Germans. My father told me, it was his impression, and I used to shake my head whenever he said it, but he said the Poles were worse than the Germans.
Wow.
So when the war ended, my father did not return to Poland. He would not.
Mm.
He never went back to Poland. He
Mm.
actually lived in Germany for 3 years.
He did?
Yes, he did.
Why did he do that?
Well, as far as he was concerned, he was stateless.
Okay.
And, right, he was a Polish citizen, not willing to go back to Poland.
Mm.
And uh, eventually he immigrated to Israel after after independence, and then later came to Canada.
Mm.
But I was sort of a little skeptical, and but when I went to Poland, I in the big cities, they're quite um, liberal, more progressive, and actually are very interested in what used to be a vibrant Jewish community that lived in Poland. Remember that there were 3.5 million Jews that lived in Poland before the war.
Mm.
Now there's thousands, but um, many of them don't even know they're Jewish because
Wow.
they've never been told. But if you go to a small town or village, like where my father was born, they're anti-Semitic there. Um, and I can sort of tell the story about how I went to the town where my grandmother was born. It's called Pinchov, and there is a old Renaissance era synagogue there. Beautiful,
Mhm.
like it was built in the 1500s. It's probably one of the oldest synagogues in Poland. It's a museum today. Um, and I remember um, speaking to one of the employees of the museum. I don't know if she was a curator or whatever. She'd come to unlock the doors for us because it was closed. And I started mentioning family names that from my family that I knew came from that town. And one of the names, she says, "Oh, there's a woman here with that name." And I'm going, "Really?" And I'm going, "Yeah." And she says, "Oh, I would love to get in contact with her." "Oh no, she won't speak to you. She doesn't want anybody to know she's Jewish." She has, and so, but I sort of pushed her and left her my contact information. When I came back to Canada several weeks later, I got an email, not from her, but from her daughter,
Oh, wow.
and who I've actually been in contact ever since. And she lives in Spain. She doesn't live in Poland. She
Oh,
said she would never go back to Poland again. And she confirmed how anti-Semitic it is.
wow.
And so, but and it's kind of, but it's not unique. Europe is really going that way
Mm.
more and more. So, if you look at what happened in Amsterdam, which a few weeks ago, it's a it's happening everywhere.
What would you tell someone listening who's experiencing anti Semitism in their life and feeling disconnected from that part, that important Jewish part of them? What would you give them advice about who they are?
Let's not make a mistake that our ancestors made, which was Europe had a history of anti-Semitism for 1,000 years, and it went in cycles. And it would get bad, and then it would get good again, and it would get bad and get good again. When Hitler came to power, people just interpreted it as it's just one of those periods where it's be bad, but things will get better. And so my message is that you can't you can't make those kind of assumptions, and that you have to be vocal, and also not just if you're Jewish, but if you are a decent person and don't like what you're seeing, being silent is being complicit. And so I tell Jewish people as well, because I get people reaching out to me all the time now for some reason. I
Right.
seem to I've seen them become better known. I'm no longer in the shadows, so to
Yeah.
speak. And I remember I was speaking to one woman who lives in a small town with almost no Jews in the U.S. And she asked me, "What can I do? It's really, really bad here." And I'm going, "You have to find allies.
Mm.
And also, you need to find other Jewish people to connect with." I said, in a larger city in that state, there's a good sized Jewish community there. There are sort of statewide organizations. You need to connect with them.
Mm.
So it's important that you connect with other Jewish people, that you're very vocal about when you see anti-Semitism and stand up to hate. Don't cower and don't assume that if you keep your head down, things will get better and it'll go away. It might not. It might get worse.
Mm. Willie, it has been an honor and a true pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I am just really touched by our conversation and your vulnerability and sharing what you're doing. How can people purchase your book? How can they get in contact with you? I'm sure that people will be listening to this and thinking of that woman who you interviewed who said, "You're one of us." I'm sure people are going to be looking for people like you.
Okay. So all my books are available on Amazon. So if you just look up my name, Willie Handler, my books will pop up, and my memoir is Out from the Shadows, and it's a tough read. That's what everybody tells me. It was a tough write. I have a website, williehandler.com, not hard to find. And I'm on a number of platforms, Facebook and Twitter. So again, all you have to do is look for Willie Handler,
Easy
and
enough.
I will pop up. So, and yes, people do reach out to me, and my wife will tell you, um, I kind of not very good at saying no to people.
Well, you have a lot to share, so it seems like you're really thriving off of this community you're building.
That wasn't the plan. It's just kind of organically happening.
Sometimes the best things happen that way.
Yeah, I think so. But it was actually it was a pleasure meeting you as well,
Yeah.
Kat, and sharing with you. So, and you showed some of your own vulnerability as well. So,
Mm.
thank you.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. All right, guys, if you loved what you heard today, go ahead and give Willie a follow. Pick up the book. I'll be reading it with you. Willie, thank you so much again.
Thank you.